The courtroom was packed that day, the air heavy with tension. A single black man sat at the defense table, his tailored suit a sharp contrast to the steely gazes of the officers seated across the aisle. His name was Malcolm Grant, and from the moment he walked into the room, you could sense he carried himself differently. Not like someone accused of a crime, but like a man with a plan. It all started 3 months ago on a rainy Tuesday evening in downtown Atlanta. Malcolm, a rising star in the world of criminal law, had just finished dinner with friends when flashing red and blue lights lit up his rearview mirror. The officers who pulled him over claimed he matched the description of a suspect wanted for armed robbery. Malcolm, calm but firm, asked for details. Instead, they cuffed him and threw him into the back of their squad car without answering a single question. The accusation was outrageous, Malcolm thought. He had spent that entire evening surrounded by colleagues, with at least a dozen witnesses to confirm his whereabouts. But as the days turned into weeks and the investigation dragged on, it became clear that this wasn't just a misunderstanding. The officers involved, Detectives Harris and Cooper, seemed determined to make the charges stick. They produced shaky witness statements and fabricated evidence, painting Malcolm as the criminal mastermind behind a string of robberies he had no connection to. What they didn't count on was who Malcolm truly was. He wasn't just any defense attorney. He had spent years building a reputation for dismantling weak cases and exposing corruption. And this time, the stakes were personal. Malcolm knew he had to play this carefully. His freedom and career were on the line, but more than that, he wanted to expose the injustice and corruption festering in the system. The case became a media circus. Headlines splashed across news channels and social media, painted conflicting pictures of Malcolm. Some portrayed him as a respected lawyer caught in a grave mistake, while others questioned whether he was hiding a darker side. The police leaned into the narrative of Malcolm being a wolf in sheep's clothing, using his legal expertise to cover his tracks. But to those who truly knew him, the idea was laughable. Malcolm had spent years fighting for justice, especially for marginalized communities. Now he was fighting for his own. In the courtroom, Malcolm's demeanor was unshakable. Every piece of evidence the prosecution presented, he dismantled with precision. Witnesses called to the stand faltered under cross-examination. And yet, there was an elephant in the room, the detectives who had built the case against him. Malcolm's legal team suspected there was more to their actions than just a botched investigation. Rumors of their misconduct had circulated for years, but no one had been able to pin anything on them. That's when Malcolm decided to take a bold gamble. Just days before the trial was set to conclude, he made an unprecedented move. He announced his decision to represent himself in court. His legal team was stunned, the prosecutors were smug, and the detectives. They looked like they'd seen a ghost. Malcolm had uncovered something. Over the course of the trial, he had quietly pieced together a web of lies that stretched far beyond his own case. It wasn't just about proving his innocence anymore. It was about exposing a system that allowed officers like Harris and Cooper to operate with impunity. And now, Malcolm was about to show the court exactly how deep the corruption ran. The courtroom fell silent as Malcolm rose to address the jury. His voice was steady, but his words carried the weight of a man who knew the stakes better than anyone. Ladies and gentlemen, I am here today not just as the accused, but as someone who has witnessed the cracks in our justice system firsthand. What you're about to hear will challenge everything you've been told about this case and the people who built it. As he spoke, the detectives exchanged uneasy glances. For the first time since the trial began, the power dynamic in the room shifted. The jury leaned in, the judge adjusted her glasses, and the reporters in the back scribbled furiously. Malcolm had everyone's attention, and what he revealed next would send shockwaves through the entire courtroom. But that's where this part of the story ends. What did Malcolm uncover? How did he turn the tide against the very people who tried to destroy him? Stay tuned, because the truth is about to come out, and it's bigger than anyone imagined. The tension in the courtroom was almost unbearable as Malcolm walked back to the defense table, a stack of papers in his hand. Every step he took felt like a challenge to the detectives sitting across the aisle. Their confident smirks from earlier in the trial were now gone, replaced by nervous glances and whispered exchanges. Whatever Malcolm had up his sleeve, they knew it wasn't good for them. The judge cleared her throat, breaking the heavy silence. "Mr. Grant, you may proceed." Malcolm placed the papers neatly on the table, pausing for a moment to meet the eyes of each juror. He wasn't just speaking to them, he was inviting them to see the truth for themselves. "Before we continue," he began, "I want to take you all back to where this started. Not just the night of my arrest, but the patterns, the behaviors, and the decisions that brought us here." He turned toward the gallery, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "I've spent my career defending people who've been wrongfully accused. I've seen cases where evidence was twisted, witnesses were coerced, and truth became a casualty of convenience. But never did I think I would become the target of the very system I've fought to reform." The jurors were hanging on his every word. Malcolm had a way of speaking that made you want to listen, like every sentence carried something important. He wasn't just reciting facts. He was telling a story, one that felt too real to ignore. "Let's talk about the night in question," he continued, pacing slowly. "The prosecution claims I was seen near the scene of the crime, a robbery at a jewelry store downtown. They have witnesses who positively identified me, and they've presented evidence tying me to the crime. But what they haven't told you is how that evidence came to be. And that's where the real story begins." He pulled out a photograph and held it up. "This is the footage from the store's security camera, taken the night of the robbery. The prosecution claims that this grainy image is me. But if you look closely, really closely, you'll see the height and build of the individual don't match mine. In fact, they don't match any logical description of me at all." He handed copies of the photo to the jury, letting them examine it for themselves. A few raised their eyebrows, clearly noticing the discrepancies Malcolm pointed out. Others exchanged glances, already questioning what they had been told. Malcolm continued, his voice growing more intense. "But that's not all. Let's talk about the so-called witnesses. 2 people who claim they saw me fleeing the scene. One of them, a man named Victor Diaz, works as a janitor at the store. The other, a young woman named Carla Brooks, says she was waiting for a bus nearby. On the surface, their stories seem believable. But what happens when you dig a little deeper?" He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "Victor Diaz has a long history of arrests for petty theft and drug possession. He was facing charges just a month before this trial began. Charges that mysteriously disappeared after he agreed to testify. And Carla Brooks. She's a struggling single mother who received an anonymous payment to her bank account just days after giving her statement. Coincidence? I think not." The jurors were visibly uneasy now, shifting in their seats as they absorbed the implications. Malcolm's words weren't just poking holes in the prosecution's case. They were unraveling it entirely. But Malcolm wasn't done. He turned his attention to the detectives, his gaze sharp and unrelenting. Detectives Harris and Cooper. 2 decorated officers with decades of experience between them. Men sworn to uphold the law and protect the innocent. But what happens when those sworn to protect us decide to bend the rules for their own gain? The detectives stiffened in their seats, their discomfort evident. Malcolm picked up a thick binder and held it up for everyone to see. "This," he said, "is a collection of complaints filed against these 2 officers over the years. Allegations of excessive force, evidence tampering, and false arrests. Most of these complaints were dismissed without investigation. Why? Because no one dared to challenge them. Until now." He opened the binder and read aloud one of the complaints, detailing how Harris and Cooper allegedly coerced a confession from a young man who was later proven innocent by DNA evidence. The room was silent except for the sound of Malcolm's voice, every word cutting through the tension like a knife. "But perhaps the most damning piece of evidence isn't in this binder," Malcolm said, setting it aside. "It's in their own actions during this case. The night I was arrested, I repeatedly asked to see the warrant. They couldn't produce one. Why? Because it didn't exist. They claimed to have probable cause based on an anonymous tip. But when we traced the tip, It led back to a burner phone registered to an alias connected to Detective Harris. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The detective's attorney jumped to his feet, objecting loudly, but the judge waved him down, signaling for Malcolm to continue. The atmosphere was electric, the sense of a turning tide almost palpable. "And there's more," Malcolm said, his voice unwavering. "The jewelry stolen from the store. It was recovered during a raid led by these same detectives. But the timing doesn't add up. The robbery was reported at 8:45 p.m. The raid took place at 9:30 p.m., less than an hour later. Are we really supposed to believe they identified a suspect, obtained a search warrant, and executed a raid in under 45 minutes? Or is it more likely they already had the items and needed someone to pin them on?" Malcolm's words landed like a hammer, each point driving home the possibility that this entire case was a setup. The jurors were no longer just listening, they were questioning everything. The prosecution looked visibly shaken, rifling through their notes as if trying to salvage their case on the spot. The detectives, however, were frozen. For the first time, the smug confidence they had carried throughout the trial was gone. Malcolm wasn't just defending himself. He was exposing them, piece by piece, in front of the very system they had manipulated for years. As Malcolm returned to his seat, the room buzzed with quiet whispers. The judge called for a recess, her voice cutting through the tension. "We will reconvene in 15 minutes, she said, banging her gavel. Malcolm leaned back in his chair, his face calm, but his mind racing. He had made his move, but the game was far from over. The next step would be the hardest, tying everything together and proving, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that he was innocent and that the real criminals were sitting just a few feet away. But for now, the suspense hung heavy in the air, the promise of truth tantalizingly close yet still out of reach. Everyone in that room knew one thing for certain. When the trial resumed, the real fight would begin. As the courtroom cleared for recess, Malcolm sat quietly, his eyes scanning the room. He noticed the nervous energy among the prosecution team, their hushed whispers filled with urgency. Across the aisle, Detectives Harris and Cooper were hunched together, their heads down, likely strategizing their next move. Malcolm couldn't help but wonder if they were finally feeling the weight of their inactions. He knew the battle was far from over, but the cracks were beginning to show. In the hallway, Malcolm's former legal team caught up with him. They had been skeptical about his decision to represent himself, but now their expressions were a mix of surprise and admiration. One of them, Cynthia, leaned in close. "You're ratting them, Malcolm." That was masterful. "But be careful, they won't go down without a fight." Malcolm nodded. He appreciated her concern, but this wasn't just about winning a case. This was about exposing a system that allowed people like Harris and Cooper to thrive. He thought about the countless faces he had defended over the years, people who had been crushed by the same machinery that was now aimed at him. This wasn't just his fight. It was theirs too. Back in the courtroom, the tension was even thicker than before. The judge called the session back to order, and the prosecution resumed their questioning. They called Victor Diaz to the stand, the janitor who claimed to have seen Malcolm near the scene of the crime. Malcolm watched closely as Victor shuffled to the witness chair, his movements jittery and uncertain. The prosecutor started with gentle questions, establishing Victor's background and connection to the store. But when it came time for cross-examination, Malcolm rose from his seat, his presence commanding the attention of everyone in the room. "Mr. Diaz," Malcolm began, his tone calm but probing, "you testified that you saw me near the jewelry store the night of the robbery. Is that correct?" Victor nodded, avoiding Malcolm's gaze. "Yes, I saw you." "And you're absolutely certain it was me?" Malcolm asked, stepping closer to the witness stand. Victor hesitated, glancing at the prosecutor before replying. "Yes, I'm sure." Malcolm paused, letting the silence stretch. Then he reached into his stack of papers and pulled out a time-stamped photo. "This is a security camera image from the restaurant where I was dining that evening. It places me miles away from the scene at the exact time you claim you saw me. Can you explain that?" Victor's eyes widened, his confidence crumbling. I don't know. Maybe I have the time wrong. Maybe, Malcolm said, his voice tightening. Or maybe you were pressured into identifying me. Tell me, Mr. Diaz, did anyone suggest you should point the finger at me? Perhaps offered you something in exchange? The courtroom held its breath as Victor fidgeted in his seat. He looked toward the detectives, his face pale. I didn't want to get involved. They told me it would be easy. Who told you? Malcolm pressed. Was it Detective Harris? Detective Cooper. Victor's silence spoke volumes. The judge intervened, instructing him to answer the question. But he only shook his head, mumbling incoherently. Malcolm didn't need a confession. The jury had seen enough. Next, it was Carla Brooks's turn. Malcolm approached her carefully, aware of the human cost her testimony carried. Carla was young, nervous, and clearly out of her depth. She clutched the edges of the witness stand like it was the only thing keeping her upright. Miss Brooks, Malcolm began softly, I understand you're in a difficult position. You testified that you saw me near the bus stop the night of the robbery. Can you tell the court exactly what you saw? Carla's voice trembled as she recounted her story, but it was filled with inconsistencies. She stumbled over details, contradicting herself more than once. Malcolm listened patiently, then presented her with a series of questions designed to poke holes in her account. You testified that the man you saw was wearing a dark hoodie. Is that correct? He asked. Yes, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. And yet, when the police arrested me, I was wearing a suit. Did they tell you to focus on me specifically when identifying a suspect? Carla hesitated, her eyes darting toward the detectives. They said they thought it was you. That's all. Malcolm leaned in slightly, his voice gentle but firm. Carla, did someone pay you to testify against me? The question hit like a thunderclap. Carla's face flushed, and her hands gripped the stand tighter. I don't know what you're talking about. Malcolm pulled out bank records, showing a mysterious deposit into her account shortly after her statement was given. This deposit, it's untraceable, but it appeared right after you identified me. I didn't blame you, Carla. I know how hard it is to make ends meet, but I need you to tell the truth. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she didn't say another word. The tension in the room was unbearable. Malcolm stepped back, letting the jury absorb what they had just seen. As the day wore on, Malcolm continued dismantling the prosecution's case piece by piece. Each new revelation painted a clearer picture of a system manipulated by those who were supposed to uphold it. The detective's credibility was crumbling, and the prosecution was running out of options. But Malcolm wasn't satisfied. He knew there was more, something bigger that tied everything together. That night, back at his apartment, he pored over the files again, looking for the one thread that would unravel the entire conspiracy. His phone buzzed, and he saw a message from an anonymous number. They're watching you. Be careful. Malcolm stared at the screen, his mind racing. Was it a warning? A threat? He couldn't be sure, but one thing was clear. He was getting closer to the truth, and someone didn't want him to find it. The next morning, Malcolm arrived at the courthouse early. He hadn't slept much after receiving the cryptic text, but the adrenaline pushing him forward was stronger than any exhaustion. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was pulling strings behind the scenes, someone with the power to make people like Harris and Cooper untouchable. Whoever it was, they were watching him now, and that only made him more determined to uncover the truth. The courtroom was unusually quiet as people filed in. There was an undercurrent of unease in the air, a sense that something significant was about to happen. Malcolm scanned the room, his eyes lingering on Harris and Cooper. They were stiff, their faces expressionless, but Malcolm could see the tension in the way he sat. They knew he was getting closer. The prosecution called their final witness, a forensic analyst who had examined the supposed evidence linking Malcolm to the robbery. The man testified with confidence, explaining how fingerprints had been found on a piece of jewelry recovered during the raid. The prosecutor leaned into this point, emphasizing how this physical evidence tied everything together. But Malcolm was ready. When it was his turn to cross-examine, he approached the witness with deliberate steps, holding a small envelope in his hand. "Mr. Carter," he began, his tone neutral, "you testified that my fingerprints were found on the jewelry. Is that correct?" "Yes," the analyst replied. "The prints were a match." Malcolm nodded, opening the envelope and pulling out a document. "This is a copy of your lab report. Can you confirm that this is the same report submitted to the court?" The analyst glanced at it and nodded. "Yes, that's correct." "Excellent," Malcolm said. "Now, according to your report, the fingerprints were identified using a process called latent print analysis. Can you explain for the jury how this works?" The analyst launched into a detailed explanation, describing how prints are lifted, compared, and matched. Malcolm let him speak, waiting for the right moment to interrupt.